December 22nd, 1944, 0614 hours, 3 kilometers southeast of Bastogne, Belgium. The temperature stood at minus 11 degrees Celsius, cold enough that Danny Kowalski's breath froze to his wool scarf in a crystalline mask that cracked when he moved his jaw. Through the narrow viewport of his Sherman M4A3E8, he could see dawn breaking across the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes, revealing a landscape that had become a graveyard for American armor in the past week. 7 destroyed Shermans lay scattered across the ridgeline to his north, their blackened hulls testimony to the brutal mathematics of German 80mm high-velocity guns versus American 76mm armor plate. Kowalski pressed his eye against the periscope, scanning the tree line 800 meters distant, where intelligence reported German panzers had assembled during the night. His hands, even through 2 pairs of gloves, had gone numb an hour ago. The modified periscope he jerry-rigged 2 days earlier looked absurd even to him. A piece of coat hanger wire, bent at precise angles and attached to the periscope housing with electrical tape and a strip of canvas torn from his bedroll, created what amounted to a crude range-finding sight. The wire's shadow, when aligned with distant objects at specific angles, gave him distance estimates accurate to within 50 meters at ranges up to 1,500 meters. It was the kind of improvisation his father would have recognized immediately, the same principle used for decades by surveyors laying out property lines across Nebraska farmland. But his father had never used it to aim a 76mm M1A2 gun at German armor. The platoon had lost 3 tanks in the past 72 hours. Lieutenant Morrison's Sherman had taken an 80mm round through the turret front at Aero 847 on the 20th, killing Morrison and his gunner instantly. Sergeant Paulson's tank burned for 4 hours after a Panzerfaust hit at close range on the 21st. And yesterday morning, at 10:35 hours, Corporal Davidson's crew bailed out after German armor-piercing rounds penetrated their engine compartment from a range so extreme that Davidson never even saw the muzzle flash. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. German tank destroyers and Panthers engaged American Shermans from distances where the Sherman crews couldn't accurately determine range, let alone score killing hits. By the time Sherman gunners realized they were under fire, German rounds were already cracking through American armor. Movement, 11 o'clock, tree line. The voice belonged to Private First Class Jimmy Chen, Kowalski's loader, a 20-year-old from San Francisco who could slam a 76mm round into the breech faster than anyone in the company. Chen had been loading ammunition in his family's hardware store since age 12, and those years of repetitive motion had given him reflexes that kept their gun firing when other crews were still fumbling with shells. Kowalski adjusted his position, bringing the modified periscope to bear on the indicated area. At first, he saw nothing. Then, as the dawn light strengthened, he caught the telltale exhaust signature, a shimmer of heat distortion rising from the tree line approximately 950 meters distant. He aligned his coat hanger wire with the target, measuring the angle, calculating the distance using the method he'd refined through trial and error. 960 meters, give or take 20. Range 960, armor piercing, he called to Chen. The familiar clank of a shell being loaded echoed through the turret. Behind him, in the driver's compartment, Corporal Mike Sullivan from Boston kept the engine at idle, ready to move the instant Kowalski gave the order. Sullivan had driven taxis through Boston traffic for 3 years before the war, which made him the best Sherman driver in the battalion, capable of reversing the 33-ton tank through terrain that would stall other crews. Through his periscope, Kowalski watched the German vehicle emerge from the tree line. It was a Jagdpanzer IV, Germany's newest tank destroyer, mounting a 75mm L-48 gun capable of penetrating Sherman armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. Its low silhouette and sloped frontal armor made it nearly invincible to American tank fire except at point-blank range or from the sides. At this distance, a Sherman's chances of penetrating its glacis plate were essentially zero. But Kowalski wasn't aiming for the glacis. The Jagdpanzer moved slowly, cautiously, its commander clearly scanning for American positions. Kowalski kept the crosshairs steady on the vehicle's lower hull, where the armor was thinner and the angle less severe. At 960 meters, this was an extremely difficult shot, made more challenging by the cold affecting the gun's recoil system and the fact that his modified rangefinder was essentially a bent piece of wire that might be off by 50 meters or more. Standard doctrine called for engaging at 400 meters or less, where gunners could rely on visual estimation and established fire tables. What Kowalski was attempting was, by every manual and training procedure, impossible. "On target," he whispered, more to himself than to Chen. The coat-hanger wire's shadow aligned perfectly with his mental calculation of 960 meters. He'd tested this modification 17 times over the past 2 days, firing at destroyed German vehicles and knocked out Shermans across the snow-covered fields around Bastogne. 12 of those 17 shots had landed within 30 meters of his estimated point of impact. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than guessing. And in the mathematics of armored combat during December 1944, better than guessing meant the difference between going home or being scraped out of a burning tank with shovels. His finger touched the trigger. The Sherman rocked backward as the 76mm gun fired, the muzzle blast kicking up a cloud of snow that momentarily obscured his view. Through the periscope, he tracked the tracer, watching it arc across nearly a kilometer of frozen Belgian farmland. The round struck low, impacting the earth approximately 40 meters short of the Jagdpanzer and 15 meters to the right. Kowalski's brain processed the miss in the 3 seconds it took Chen to reload, adjusting for the drop and drift. "Up 40, right 15, he called out, cranking the elevation wheel. The German crew had spotted them now. The Jagdpanzer's gun was traversing, searching for the source of the shot. Kowalski had perhaps 10 seconds before that 75mm gun found his Sherman, and at this range, one hit would punch through his turret like it was paper. The second shot left the muzzle with the same violent recoil. This time, Kowalski saw the impact perfectly. The armor-piercing round struck the Jagdpanzer's lower hull just above the tracks, penetrating the 30mm side armor and detonating inside the vehicle. The German tank destroyer lurched to a stop, smoke beginning to pour from its engine compartment. 3 seconds later, the entire vehicle erupted in flame as stored ammunition cooked off. "Jesus Christ, Danny, you actually hit it!" Chen's voice carried a mixture of awe and disbelief. "That was 1,000 meters. 960, Kowalski corrected automatically, already scanning for additional targets. His hands were shaking, though whether from cold, adrenaline, or the realization that his improvised rangefinder had just saved their lives, he couldn't tell. The radio crackled. "Able 2, this is Able 6. Confirm kill at 900 meters. That was Captain Harrison, the company commander, who'd been watching the engagement from his command Sherman 200 meters behind Kowalski's position. "Confirmed Able 6, Jagdpanzer 4 destroyed at 960 meters. A pause. Then, "Able 2, what the hell kind of sight are you using?" Kowalski glanced at the coat hanger wire, still attached to his periscope with electrical tape that was starting to peel in the cold. "Sir, it's hard to explain over the radio. I can show you when we pull back." "You're going to show me right now, Corporal, and then you're going to show every gunner in this company. Whatever you've got, we need it on every tank before nightfall." Before Kowalski could respond, Sullivan's urgent voice cut through from the driver's compartment. "Multiple targets, tree line, 11 o'clock. Count 4. No, 5 German tanks moving into the open." Kowalski swung his periscope. Sullivan was right. 5 German Panthers were emerging from the forest, their long 75mm KWK-42 guns already traversing toward American positions. At ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, those guns could penetrate any Sherman's armor with a single hit. And now, with dawn fully breaking, the German crews would be able to see every American position across the open ground. The radio exploded with chatter. Multiple tank commanders reporting enemy contacts, urgent calls for artillery support, the controlled panic of men realizing they were about to be caught in the open by superior German armor. Captain Harrison's voice cut through the chaos. All able units, fall back to secondary positions. I say again, fall back to... The transmission cut off as a massive explosion rocked the landscape 200 meters behind Kowalski's Sherman. Through his periscope, he caught a glimpse of Captain Harrison's tank, its turret lifting completely off the hull ring as an 80mm round detonated its ammunition. The tank transformed from a fighting vehicle into a funeral pyre in less than 3 seconds. "Sullivan, reverse, now!" Kowalski shouted, but the driver had already thrown the transmission into reverse. The Sherman lurched backward, tracks churning through snow, as Sullivan navigated using only his periscopes. Around them, other tanks were pulling back, some moving in good order, others racing toward cover, as German rounds began landing with increasing accuracy. Kowalski kept his eye pressed to his modified periscope, scanning the advancing Panthers. They were moving in a staggered line, maintaining intervals of approximately 100 meters between vehicles. Textbook German armor tactics designed to prevent multiple losses from a single artillery strike. The nearest Panther was now at 1,150 meters and closing, its turret rotating as its commander searched for targets. Chen, load armor piercing. Sullivan, halt on my command. Kowalski's voice was steadier than he felt. The mathematics of what he was about to attempt were brutal. A Panther's frontal armor ranged from 80mm to 100mm thick, sloped at angles that increased its effective thickness to nearly 140mm. A Sherman's 76mm gun, firing M93 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap rounds, could penetrate approximately 170mm of armor at 1,000 meters under ideal conditions. At 150 meters, against sloped armor while moving, the probability of penetration dropped to near zero. But Kowalski wasn't aiming for frontal armor. Halt! Sullivan brought the Sherman to a jarring stop, the sudden cessation of movement causing Kowalski's periscope view to stabilize. The nearest Panther had turned slightly, presenting its side to Kowalski's position. The side armor of a Panther measured 40mm to 50mm thick, depending on the location. At 150 meters, that was penetrable, barely. He aligned his coat hanger wire, measuring the angle, calculating the range. The wire's shadow fell perfectly on his mental mark for 150 meters. He adjusted for a 15km/h wind from the west, for the temperature's effect on muzzle velocity, for the fact that they were firing from a slight depression that required an additional 2 degrees of elevation. On target. The 76mm gun spoke. Through the periscope, Kowalski watched the tracer arc across nearly 1,200 meters of snow-covered ground. The round struck the Panther exactly where its turret met the hull, penetrating the thinner armor at the turret ring. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the Panther's engine died, the tank coasting to a stop. Its crew began bailing out, abandoning the vehicle as smoke poured from every hatch. 2 for 2, Chen breathed. Danny, that's 2,000-meter shots in 5 minutes. But Kowalski was already calculating the next target. 4 Panthers remained, and they'd seen where his shot originated. German doctrine called for immediate suppression of any position that scored a hit, which meant that within seconds, multiple 75mm guns would be firing at his Sherman. The mathematics were simple and merciless. He could maybe get one more shot off before German fire forced them to displace, and that one shot had to count. The second Panther in line presented the best angle, its hull exposed at approximately 1,220 meters. Kowalski's coat hanger wire measured the range, his brain performing calculations he'd done hundreds of times, measuring distances across Nebraska cornfields, only now the stakes were 33 tons of American steel and 4 men's lives instead of property boundaries. Chen, reload. Already done. Sullivan, soon as I fire, reverse hard and get us behind that ridge line. Roger. Kowalski's finger tightened on the trigger. The instant before he fired, he saw the Panther's gun flash. Somewhere in the microsecond before his own round left the muzzle, his brain registered that a German 75mm armor-piercing round was now racing toward his Sherman at 925 meters per second. That at this range, it would arrive in approximately 1.3 seconds, and that there was absolutely nothing he could do about it, except hope German gunnery was less accurate than his improvised rangefinder. The Sherman fired. Sullivan threw the transmission into reverse. And somewhere in the chaos of muzzle blast, and engine roar, and tracks churning through frozen earth, Kowalski heard a sound like God himself hitting an anvil with a sledgehammer. The German round struck their Sherman's glacis plate at an oblique angle, the armor-piercing cap penetrating perhaps 2 inches before the round deflected upward, screaming over the turret and detonating 50 meters behind them. The entire tank shuddered from the impact, but held together. Through his periscope, Kowalski saw his own round strike home. The second Panther lurched sideways, its left track blown completely off the drive sprocket. The tank slewed to a halt, immobilized, and its crew began evacuating immediately. 2 disabled in 2 shots, but 3 Panthers remained, and now they were all focused on his position. Sullivan, get us over that ridgeline, now. The Sherman's engine screamed as Sullivan poured on speed in reverse, navigating blind through terrain that could hide ditches, destroyed vehicles, or any of 1,000 obstacles that could bog them down in the open. German rounds began impacting around them, 75mm high explosive shells that detonated in geysers of frozen earth and snow. One round struck so close that shrapnel rattled against the Sherman's hull like hail. They crested the ridgeline and dropped behind it, the ridgeline's mass providing blessed cover from direct fire. Sullivan immediately spun the tank around, bringing them bow forward so they could move quickly if needed. Around them, other surviving Shermans were pulling into position, some damaged, all with crews whose faces showed the strain of losing 2 tanks in as many minutes. Kowalski took a shuddering breath, his first since the engagement began. His modified periscope, that absurd coat hanger wire and electrical tape contraption, had just enabled 2 kills at ranges that shouldn't have been possible for Sherman tanks. But it had also painted a target on his Sherman that every German gun in the area would now be watching for. The radio crackled with Lieutenant Morrison's second-in-command, a freshly promoted sergeant named Peters. All Able units, this is Able 6 actual. Hold this position until further orders. We've got infantry moving up to our flanks. Artillery plotting fires on the enemy position. Stay sharp. Kowalski pulled back from his periscope, wiping sweat from his face despite the sub-zero temperature. Chen was already breaking out ration packs, the loader's hands moving through familiar motions that required no thought. Sullivan had killed the engine to reduce their thermal signature, and in the sudden silence, Kowalski could hear his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. "Hey, Danny." Chen's voice was quiet. "That wire thing. Where'd you learn that?" And suddenly, Kowalski was back in Nebraska, standing in a cornfield on a summer morning that felt like it belonged to a different planet, learning from his father how to survey property lines using nothing but string, angles, and trigonometry that hadn't changed since Pythagoras. He hadn't thought about those summer mornings in months, hadn't let himself think about home or family or anything beyond the next target, the next shot, the next desperate attempt to keep his tank and his crew alive through another day. But Chen's question opened a door Kowalski had kept firmly closed since landing in France in June. "My dad," he finally answered. "My dad taught me." And as German artillery began falling on the American positions, as the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its desperate climax around the surrounded town of Bastogne, as the temperature dropped another 3 degrees and ammunition handlers struggled to load rounds that had contracted in the cold, Danny Kowalski began to explain to his crew how a coat hanger wire and the principles of farm surveying were going to kill a lot more German tanks before this was over. But first, he needed to survive the next 5 minutes, because through a gap in the ridgeline, exactly 1,382 meters distant by his estimation, a Tiger Bass heavy tank was emerging from the tree line. Its massive 80mm KWK 36L56 gun already traversing toward American positions, and every gunner in the company knew that a Tiger's frontal armor was impervious to Sherman fire at any range beyond point blank. Kowalski pressed his eye back to his modified periscope, lined up his coat hanger wire on the approaching behemoth, and began calculating angles he'd learned measuring corn rows, now applied to the mathematics of killing a 56-ton German tank before it killed him. The wire's shadow aligned at 1,080 meters, give or take 30. Chen slammed a fresh round into the breach, and somewhere in the frozen hills around Bastogne, the improvised geometry of survival was about to be tested against 100mm of German armor plate. The Tiger's engine rumble carried across 1,380 meters of frozen Belgian farmland, a deep mechanical growl that every American tank crew had learned to fear. Kowalski kept his eye pressed against his modified periscope, the coat hanger wire's shadow measuring the distance, with a precision that still seemed impossible even to him. Behind him, Chen had already loaded an armor-piercing round, though both of them knew that a Tiger's frontal armor could laugh off Sherman fire from twice this range. The mathematics were brutal and simple. 100mm of face-hardened steel, sloped at angles that increased effective thickness to nearly 120mm versus a 76mm gun that could barely penetrate 170mm under ideal conditions. This wasn't an ideal condition. This was 1,080 meters in sub-zero temperatures with a tank that was already marked by every German gun crew in the sector. "Sullivan, you see that drainage ditch at 10 o'clock, about 40 meters? Kowalski's voice was steady despite the ice forming in his gut. "Soon as I fire, get us into it. We're going to need defilade fast." "Roger that." Sullivan's Boston accent was thicker when he was scared, and right now it was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Danny, you know that's a Tiger, right? We can't hurt that thing from here." "We're not shooting at its front," Kowalski replied, watching the massive tank lumber forward at perhaps 15 kilometers per hour. The Tiger commander was being cautious, scanning the ridgeline where American tanks had taken cover, probably coordinating with the surviving Panthers. Smart tactics, German armor doctrine emphasized combined operations, mutual support, overwhelming firepower. A Tiger didn't need to rush. It could sit back and methodically destroy American positions while remaining invulnerable to return fire. Except this Tiger commander had made one critical mistake. He'd angled his hull slightly to traverse rough ground, presenting perhaps 20 degrees of side armor to Kowalski's position. 20 degrees wasn't much, but it was enough. The Tiger's side armor measured 80 millimeters thick, vertical, without the benefit of sloping. At 1,080 meters, Kowalski's 76mm gun-firing M93 APC-BC rounds could theoretically penetrate 95mm of vertical armor. Theoretically. The actual penetration would depend on a dozen factors: the exact composition of the German armor plate, whether it had been face-hardened, the temperature's effect on the round's ballistic cap, the precise angle of impact. But theory was all Kowalski had. theory, and a bent coat hanger wire that measured distances using trigonometry his father had taught him for surveying cornfields. "Chen, you loaded?" "Been loaded. Waiting on you, farm boy." Kowalski adjusted the turret traverse with minute movements, aligning his crosshairs on the Tiger's side, just behind the forward drive sprocket, where the armor was perpendicular to his line of sight. His coat hanger wire measured 1,380 meters. He added 3 degrees of elevation for the distance, compensated for a 12-kilometer-per-hour crosswind from the northwest, adjusted for the fact that cold had reduced his muzzle velocity by approximately 2%, and said a brief prayer to whatever deity watched over Nebraska farm boys trying to kill German heavy tanks with improvised rangefinders. The 76mm gun fired. The Sherman rocked backward, muzzle blast kicking up a wall of snow. Through his periscope, Kowalski tracked the tracer, watching it arc across nearly 1,400 meters of frozen landscape. The flight time seemed to last forever, 3 full seconds, while his brain calculated impact points and Sullivan prepared to move and Chen readied the next round, and somewhere in the distance German crews were undoubtedly training their guns on the Sherman that had just given away its position. The round struck the Tiger's side armor 30 centimeters behind where Kowalski had aimed, hitting at an angle that was perhaps 5 degrees less optimal than he'd calculated. For a microsecond, nothing happened. Then the armor-piercing cap bit into the 80mm plate, the main projectile driving through, and the explosive filler detonated inside the Tiger's crew compartment. The massive tank didn't explode dramatically. Instead, it simply stopped, smoke beginning to pour from every hatch and vision port. 5 seconds later, the commander's hatch flew open and crew began bailing out, moving with the frantic urgency of men who knew their ammunition could cook off at any moment. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," Sullivan breathed. "He killed a tiger. Danny killed a goddamn tiger at 1,400 meters. Sullivan, ditch, now!" Kowalski's shout snapped the driver back to reality. The Sherman lurched forward, tracks churning, as Sullivan navigated toward the drainage ditch. They'd barely moved 20 meters when a German 75mm round impacted exactly where they'd been positioned 3 seconds earlier, the explosion showering their rear deck with frozen earth and shrapnel. The Sherman dropped into the drainage ditch with a jarring crash that threw Kowalski against his periscope. The ditch was perhaps 2 meters deep, just enough to hide the Sherman's hull while keeping the turret exposed for firing. Sullivan immediately killed the engine, reducing their thermal signature. Around them, the Battle of the Bulge continued its grinding, desperate mathematics of survival. But for one brief moment, Kowalski's crew sat in relative safety, processing what had just happened. The radio crackled. "Able 2, Able 7. Confirmed that was your shot on the Tiger." The voice belonged to Sergeant Richards, whose Sherman was positioned 150 meters to their right. "Please tell me that was your shot." "Confirmed, Able 7. Tiger destroyed at 1380. A long pause. Then, "Able 2. Every gunner in this battalion needs to see whatever the hell you're using for a sight. That's 3 kills past 1,000 meters in under an hour. That's not possible unless you're using something we don't know about." Before Kowalski could respond, a new voice cut through the radio traffic, crackling with the authority of battalion command. "All Able units, this is Baker 6. Able 2, you are ordered to pull back to battalion headquarters immediately. Repeat, immediately. We need that site documented and replicated." Kowalski looked at his coat hanger wire, still attached to his periscope with electrical tape that was now definitely peeling in the cold. The wire had been bent from a coat hanger he'd scavenged from a destroyed Belgian farmhouse 3 days earlier, shaped according to angles he'd memorized surveying fields back in Nebraska, attached with materials found in his tank's sponson box. The entire contraption had cost exactly nothing and taken him perhaps 45 minutes to fabricate, and it had just killed 3 German tanks at ranges that shouldn't have been possible. Roger. Baker 6. Able 2, pulling back to Battalion HQ. Sullivan fired up the engine and began navigating out of the drainage ditch, using the cover of terrain to mask their movement. As they pulled back through frozen fields littered with destroyed vehicles and shell craters, Kowalski kept scanning through his modified periscope, the habit now so ingrained that he couldn't stop even when ordered to disengage. Chen had broken out ration packs, forcing Sullivan and Kowalski to eat, even though neither man felt hungry. Combat did that, suppressed appetite while burning calories at an impossible rate, leaving men hollow-eyed and gaunt despite regular meals. Battalion headquarters occupied a commandeered Belgian farmhouse 2 kilometers behind the front line, its stone walls thick enough to provide some protection from artillery fragments. Kowalski's Sherman pulled into the farm's courtyard at 0847 hours, parking alongside 3 other tanks that bore the scars of recent combat. A captain Kowalski didn't recognize was waiting, flanked by 2 lieutenants and a major, whose uniform identified him as belonging to Ordnance Corps. Corporal Kowalski? The captain's voice carried the flat accent of somewhere in the Midwest, probably Michigan. I'm Captain Edwards, S3 Operations. This is Major Hartley from Ordnance. We need to see this sight system immediately. Kowalski climbed out of his turret, his legs stiff from hours of sitting in the gunner's position. The coat hanger wire was still attached to his periscope, looking even more absurd in daylight than it had felt in combat. He carefully detached it, trying not to bend the wire or disturb the angles he'd so carefully calculated. Sir, it's just a piece of wire. I bent it to specific angles based on surveying principles my father taught me. When you align the wire's shadow with distant objects through the periscope, you can estimate range pretty accurately out to about 1,500 meters. Major Hartley took the wire, examining it with the careful attention of an engineer encountering something that shouldn't work but clearly did. This is trigonometry, he said slowly. You're using angular measurement to calculate distance, but how do you know the angles are correct? Trial and error, sir. I tested it on destroyed vehicles, measured the distances using the odometer on our tank, then adjusted the wire until the angles matched. It took about a day to calibrate, but once I had it set, it's been accurate to within maybe 30 meters at 1,000 meters, 50 meters at 1,500. The major was scribbling notes furiously. And you can replicate this? You can teach other gunners how to make and use these? Kowalski nodded. Yes, sir. It's not complicated. You need a piece of stiff wire about 8 inches long, a way to measure angles accurately for the initial bend, and time to calibrate it for your specific periscope and gun. Maybe 2 hours of work plus half a day of testing. Captain Edwards and Major Hartley exchanged glances. Corporal, in the past hour, you've destroyed 3 German tanks at ranges where our doctrine says engagement is impossible. One of those was a Tiger, which we generally can't kill from the front at any range. If we can put your modification on every Sherman in this division, we fundamentally change the mathematics of armored combat. Over the next 4 hours, Kowalski taught a crash course in improvised range-finding to every available tank gunner in the battalion. He explained the trigonometry, demonstrated how to bend the wire to specific angles, showed them how to calibrate using known distances. The ordnance major documented everything with photographs and precise measurements, already planning how to mass-produce standardized versions. But for now, each gunner would make their own. Bending coat hangers or stiff wire scavenged from destroyed vehicles, creating crude but effective rangefinders using principles that hadn't changed since ancient Greek mathematicians first calculated angles. By 1430 hours, 22 Sherman tanks in the battalion had been retrofitted with Kowalski's modification. The wire devices varied slightly, each gunner making small adjustments to account for their specific periscope and personal preferences, but all used the same fundamental principle. At 1530 hours, the battalion received orders to move back into defensive positions southeast of Bastogne. German forces were preparing another major push. Intelligence suggested at least 2 panzer divisions were concentrating for an assault that evening. The defenders of Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, would need every advantage they could get. December 22nd, 1944, 1847 hours. The German assault came at dusk, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Kowalski's Sherman was positioned on the eastern flank, hull down behind a small rise that provided defilade while allowing their gun clear fields of fire. Through his modified periscope, he watched German armor emerge from the tree line set to 100 meters distant. He counted 4 Panthers, 2 Panzerwerfers, and what looked like a Stuggy 3 assault gun, all advancing in coordinated formation with infantry support trailing behind. All able units, weapons hold until my command. The new company commander, a lieutenant who'd been promoted that morning after Captain Harrison's death, sounded young and uncertain. Wait until they're at 800 meters, then engage on my command. Kowalski lined up his coat hanger wire on the nearest Panther, 1,180 meters. Well within his effective range, but the lieutenant wanted to wait until 800 meters, which meant giving German tanks another 380 meters to identify American positions and fire first. The mathematics didn't favor patience. Able 6, Able 2. Request permission to engage at current range. I have clear shot at 1,100 meters. Negative Able 2. Hold position. We engage together at 800. Kowalski watched the Panthers advance, their commanders scanning for threats, their guns traversing as they searched for American positions. At 1,100 meters, Sherman tanks were essentially invisible to German gunners. At 800 meters, they'd stand out clearly, and German guns would have time to acquire targets and fire before American crews could return effective fire. The lieutenant's tactics guaranteed casualties. Able 6, Able 2. With respect, sir, if we let them close to 800, we lose the advantage. They'll see us and engage first. Request permission to fire now. A pause. Then, all units, this is Able 6. Able 2 has demonstrated he can hit at extended range. If Able 2 achieves kill at current distance, all units weapons free. If not, we hold to 800 meters. Kowalski adjusted his turret traverse, bringing the crosshairs onto the lead Panther. Chen had already loaded armor-piercing, Sullivan had the engine at idle ready to move, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, 22 other Sherman gunners were watching to see if the farm boy from Nebraska could do it again. His coat hanger wire measured 1,180 meters. He compensated for wind, temperature, the angle of his position relative to the target. The Panther was moving at approximately 18 kilometers per hour, traversing from left to right across his field of view, which required leading the target by calculating where the tank would be during the round's 3-second flight time. It was the kind of shot that gunnery school instructors would have called reckless. It was also necessary. The 76mm gun fired. The round crossed 1,180 meters in just under 3 seconds, impacting the Panther's side armor between the second and third road wheels. The penetration was clean, the tank lurching to a stop as smoke poured from its engine compartment. The crew bailed out immediately, and the Panther sat immobilized, blocking the advance of vehicles behind it. Weapons free, all units engage. The lieutenant's voice carried new confidence. Across the American line, 22 Shermans, equipped with Kowalski's modifications, opened fire at ranges that German commanders hadn't thought possible. The effect was devastating. At 100 to 1,300 meters, Sherman gunners were engaging German armor before German crews even realized they were under fire. The second Panther in line took a hit from Sergeant Richards's tank at 1,240 meters, the round penetrating through the turret side. A Panzer IV exploded at 1,180 meters, hit by a shot from Lieutenant Morrison's replacement. The Stuggy 3, attempting to reverse back into cover, took 2 hits simultaneously at ranges exceeding 1,200 meters. Kowalski was already tracking his second target, a Panther that had turned to present its frontal armor, thinking it was safe at this range. But the turn exposed its side to Able 7's position, and Kowalski watched as Sergeant Richards's shot penetrated the thinner side armor, immobilizing the tank. In less than 2 minutes, 6 German tanks had been knocked out at ranges where they'd expected to advance safely. The assault stalled, German tanks retreating back toward the tree line while American gunners continued firing, scoring hits on vehicles that were desperately trying to find cover. By 1915 hours, the German assault had collapsed completely. 8 tanks destroyed, 3 more damaged and abandoned, all at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. American losses, 0. The mathematics of armored combat in the Ardennes had shifted, and German commanders didn't yet understand why. The pattern repeated over the next 7 days. Each time German armor attempted to advance on American positions, they encountered Sherman tanks, engaging from distances that shouldn't have been possible. German after-action reports, captured later, showed commanders' growing confusion. American Shermans were somehow achieving first-round hits at 1,200 meters and beyond, ranges where German doctrine assumed they'd be safe. Intelligence officers speculated about new American guns, improved ammunition, even rumors of advanced targeting systems. The truth, that American gunners were using bent coat hangers and high school trigonometry, would have seemed absurd. December 23, 1944. Kowalski's crew destroyed 4 Panzertiers and a Jagdpanzer 38 during a dawn engagement at ranges averaging 150 meters. December 24th, Christmas Eve. 3 Panthers and a Stu G3 fell to shots ranging from 1,080 to 1,340 meters. December 25th, Christmas Day. The fighting paused briefly as both sides consolidated positions, but by afternoon, German forces renewed their assault. Kowalski's crew accounted for 2 more Panthers and a Panzer IV. The coat hanger wire, now protected by a piece of canvas and multiple layers of electrical tape, continued to provide range estimates that were accurate enough to kill. December 26th brought the largest engagement. German forces, perhaps sensing that time was running out before American reinforcements arrived, launched a massive coordinated assault with at least 30 tanks. Kowalski's battalion, now with 34 Shermans, all equipped with modified rangefinders, met them at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The battle lasted 4 hours, German armor attempting to close the distance while American gunners systematically destroyed them at extended range. Kowalski personally destroyed 5 tanks that day, including 2 Tigers that made the mistake of exposing their side armor while maneuvering. Chen's loading speed never faltered. Sullivan's driving kept them mobile and protected, and the coat hanger wire continued to measure distances with impossible accuracy. By December 27th, German armored forces in this sector had been so depleted that further large-scale attacks became impossible. Small probing attacks continued, but the mathematics had shifted decisively. American tank crews, once terrified of facing German armor, now engaged with confidence born from repeated success at extended range. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical advantage. Sherman crews knew they could hurt German tanks before German tanks could hurt them, and that knowledge transformed defensive operations. December 28th and 29th saw scattered engagements as German forces attempted to withdraw heavy equipment before American reinforcements, finally breaking through to Bastogne, could cut off retreat routes. Kowalski's crew destroyed 3 more tanks during these actions, bringing their personal total to 23 confirmed kills over 8 days. Battalion totals exceeded 140 German tanks destroyed or disabled, with American losses reduced by an estimated 60% compared to previous engagement rates. On December 30th, 1944 at 14:20 hours, lead elements of Patton's Third Army reached Bastogne's perimeter, officially breaking the siege. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for several more weeks, but the desperate defensive phase was over. That evening, Major Hartley from Ordnance Corps returned to the battalion with a team of engineers and photographers. They'd spent the past week documenting the results of Kowalski's modification, compiling data on engagement ranges, hit probabilities, and tactical effectiveness. Corporal Kowalski, preliminary analysis suggests your modification has increased effective engagement range by 40 to 50% while improving first-round hit probability by approximately 35% at ranges exceeding 900 meters. We've received authorization to implement this across all Sherman tanks in the European theater. Within 2 months, every American tank will have a standardized version of your rangefinder. The Major paused, then continued. I'm also authorized to inform you that you're being promoted to sergeant and awarded the Silver Star for your actions during the defense of Bastogne. Your crew is being recommended for Bronze Stars, and your father, apparently a Mr. Thomas Kowalski of Omaha, Nebraska, has been sent a letter explaining how the surveying techniques he taught you have saved approximately 200 American lives, according to our calculations. Kowalski stood in the cold Belgian evening, his uniform still stained with the residue of 8 days of continuous combat, and thought about his father standing in Nebraska cornfields with surveying equipment, teaching a teenage boy how to measure distances using angles and trigonometry. His father had never fired a gun in anger, had never seen combat, had spent his entire life measuring property lines and drainage ditches. But the principles were the same. Distance was distance, angles were angles, and trigonometry worked whether you were surveying cornfields or killing German tanks. Sir, it's just basic math. Any gunner could have figured it out. But they didn't, Sergeant. You did. That's what matters. Over the following weeks, as American forces pushed German troops back through Belgium and into Germany itself, Kowalski's modification appeared on thousands of Sherman tanks. Ordnance Corps manufactured standardized versions, precisely calibrated wire rangefinders that attached to gunner periscopes using proper mounting brackets instead of electrical tape. They called it the M1944 Auxiliary Ranging Device, which sounded much more official than bent coat hanger. But the principle remained identical. Use angular measurements through the periscope to calculate distance, then engage targets at ranges German commanders didn't think were possible. The tactical impact spread beyond just improved engagement ranges. German armor commanders, learning that American tanks could now engage effectively past 1,000 meters, were forced to change their doctrine. They could no longer rely on sitting back at range and methodically destroying American positions. They had to close to effective range faster, which exposed them to American fire during their approach. The psychological advantage shifted. German tank crews, who'd spent years confident in their armor and guns' superiority, now approached every engagement wondering if American tanks had already acquired them at ranges they couldn't see or return fire at effectively. By February 1945, German after-action reports frequently mentioned American tanks' inexplicably accurate long-range fire. One captured Panzer Company commander's report stated, American Sherman tanks engaged our positions from approximately 1,300 meters, achieving multiple first-round hits. This is beyond the capability of the 76mm gun, according to all our intelligence assessments. We must assume the Americans have developed new fire control systems or targeting devices that provide significant advantage at extended range. They never discovered the truth was a bent coat hanger wire. Kowalski's crew continued fighting through the final months of the war, eventually crossing into Germany itself as part of the final push toward Berlin. They survived, which in itself was remarkable for Sherman crews during 1945. Sullivan's driving, Chen's loading speed, and Kowalski's modified rangefinder combined to keep them alive through battles where other tanks died. They fought in the Hürtgen forest, crossed the Rhine at Remagen, pushed through the Ruhr pocket. The coat hanger wire, now protected by official Ordnance Corps mounting brackets, but still fundamentally the same device Kowalski had improvised in December, continued to measure distances with accuracy that seemed impossible for such crude technology. The final accounting came in May 1945 after Germany's surrender. Kowalski's personal total stood at 47 confirmed tank kills, 31 of them achieved at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. His crew had fired 1,247 main gun rounds in combat, achieving a hit rate of 41% at extended range, nearly triple the normal Sherman hit rate. They'd been hit 6 times by German fire, but Sullivan's driving and their tactical positioning had prevented catastrophic damage every time. The Sherman that had carried them through the war bore the scars of 8 months of continuous combat. Patches welded over penetration attempts, replacement road wheels from various manufacturers, a turret basket that had been rebuilt twice, and a coat hanger wire attached to the gunner's periscope that had measured approximately 47,000 meters of cumulative target distance. Battalion historians documented the impact of Kowalski's modification across the entire division. Tank losses during the period from December 1944 through May 1945 were 37% lower than projected based on pre-modification casualty rates. Average engagement ranges increased from 640 meters to 980 meters. First-round hit probability at ranges exceeding 900 meters improved from 14% to 47%. The modification, which cost essentially nothing to implement and required minimal training, had fundamentally altered armored combat in the European theater's final months. But the most significant impact was harder to quantify. American tank crews approached combat with confidence rather than dread. They knew they could engage German armor at ranges where they'd previously been helpless. That confidence translated to tactical aggressiveness, to willingness to accept missions that would have seemed suicidal months earlier, to psychological dominance over German forces who couldn't understand why American tanks were suddenly so effective. On May 15, 1945, 1 week after Germany's surrender, Kowalski stood in a German equipment depot that American forces were cataloging for intelligence purposes. Rows of destroyed and captured German tanks filled the facility, representing the end of Nazi Germany's armored might. Among them sat a Tiger heavy tank, its thick armor scarred by multiple impacts, but still largely intact. Kowalski climbed onto the Tiger's hull, examining the side armor that he'd learned to penetrate with precise shots at extended range. The armor was 80 millimeter thick, exactly as intelligence had stated, but seeing it in person made those December shots seem even more impossible. Major Hartley found him there, standing on the Tiger's hull. "Contemplating your handiwork, Sergeant?" "Just thinking about mathematics, sir. About how something as simple as a bent wire in high school trigonometry changed the entire equation of armored combat." "It wasn't the wire, Sergeant. It was you recognizing the problem and finding a solution. Thousands of gunners saw the same problem. They just accepted it as unsolvable." "You didn't?" Kowalski looked at the coat hanger wire, still attached to his Sherman's periscope even though the war was over. "My father always said that most problems were just math problems in disguise. You just had to figure out which equation to use. Turns out he was right." The modification that Kowalski improvised during those desperate December days around Bastogne became standard equipment on American tanks for the remainder of 1945 and into 1946. Even as more advanced fire control systems were developed, the simple wire rangefinder remained popular with experienced crews who trusted its reliability. Some Sherman tanks retained the modification through the Korean War, where it proved equally effective against T-34 tanks at the extended ranges of Korean terrain. But by the mid-1950s, as advanced optical rangefinders and eventually laser targeting systems became standard, the coat hanger wire modification faded into history. Few modern tankers have heard of it. No monuments commemorate it. The technical manuals that documented its use were eventually archived and forgotten. Yet for 8 critical days in December 1944, and for 5 months of combat that followed, a piece of bent wire and farm surveying trigonometry gave American tank crews an advantage that saved hundreds of lives and destroyed hundreds of enemy tanks. Danny Kowalski returned to Nebraska in August 1945, was discharged with the rank of Staff Sergeant, and went back to repairing farm equipment. He married, raised 4 children, and spent 40 years as a mechanic in Omaha. He rarely talked about the war, and when he did, he focused on his crew, Sullivan and Chen, and the dozen other men who'd served with him at various times. He never mentioned the 47 tanks, never brought up the modification that changed armored combat, never sought recognition for what he'd done. His father died in 1953, never fully understanding how the surveying techniques he'd taught his son had been weaponized into a tank-killing system. But every spring, when Danny Kowalski walked through Nebraska cornfields carrying surveying equipment, measuring property lines and drainage ditches, he'd sometimes stop and look across the flat landscape, mentally calculating distances using angles and triangulation. The mathematics hadn't changed. Distance was still distance, angles were still angles, and trigonometry still worked whether you were measuring corn rows or killing German tanks. In his workshop, preserved in a glass case that his children thought was an odd keepsake, sat a piece of coat hanger wire, bent at precise angles, attached to what looked like part of a tank periscope. Below it, a small placard that Kowalski had typed on his workshop typewriter, M1944 Auxiliary Ranging Device, effective range 1,500 meters, cost 0 tiles 0 hours, results 47 enemy tanks destroyed, approximately 200 American lives saved. Never underestimate the value of basic mathematics. The wire sits there still, in a workshop in Omaha, a testament to the idea that sometimes the most effective solutions are the simplest ones. That innovation doesn't always come from laboratories and engineers, but from ordinary people applying basic principles in extraordinary circumstances. That a farm boy from Nebraska, using knowledge his father taught him for surveying cornfields, could change the mathematics of armored warfare using a bent coat hanger and high school trigonometry. 47 German tanks destroyed in 8 days. All because someone remembered that distance is just an angle problem, and angles can be measured with wire. The mathematics hadn't changed since Pythagoras. Danny Kowalski just remembered to apply them.